Hello, friends. This program is on target, and I'm Captain Garri Табах. And today it's going to go a little bit different. It's going to be in English, but with the Russian subtitles. And as you know, this program is about people who have done things for their nation, for the community, for other people. And in my opinion, my personal opinion, they're heroes. Why are they heroes? Because they paid a price. Some of them paid a price in health. Some of them paid the price financially. Some of them paid price, job-wise, career-wise. Some of them paid the price with their life and limbs. And today's guest is my friend, and I'd say he's my hero, I would say that. And he's not very well known because he is not a public figure. He does not like to appear and to give interviews, and it's understandable because his family has been mistreated and unfairly mistreated. It's been harassed, unfairly harassed by some people and entities. And I met him in 2014 when the vicious attack by Russians happened on Ukraine. And Ukrainian territory was annexed. Many Ukrainian refugees, many Ukrainian good young men and women died fighting for their country. And at that point, I thought that Ukrainians were very brave, and they stood to much bigger enemy and were defending their homeland. And I was asked to address Ukrainian diaspora, Jewish diaspora, Americans in general, bringing attention that Ukraine is out there fighting this evil, and the whole world is staying quiet. Nobody is doing anything about it. Everybody's saying, it's going to go away, like Hitler is going to go away. So when I was being filmed with this short statement that I was going to make, and I was interviewed by a very, very nice guy. I met this really nice guy, the nicest guy you could ever meet. Just a pleasant man with a great smile. The warmth was just radiating from him. And he asked me questions. He was very quiet, very modest. And then he introduced himself as Marco Bandera. And I said, Bandera, any really? And he says, yeah, that's my uncle. Stepan was my uncle. And I was like, wait a minute, this biggest anti-Semite, this biggest Nazi collaborator, and I liked this guy, and he's his nephew. But as we talked, and as of course I became interested in Stepan Bandera, and I'm starting to learn, and I saw actually CIA documents that saying, he was not an anti-Semite, and on the contrary, he was a nationalist. He was for freedom and independence of Ukraine, and whoever fought for Ukraine were Ukrainians, and whoever was against Ukraine were not Ukrainians. They were traitors, no matter which color, what religion they were. So, and that was a CIA document that was stating that, or those times CIA document. So Marco and I became friends, and we talked, and in many of my programs, I have mentioned him when I would argue with people, and I would say, listen, I know Stepan Bandera's nephew, and he's one of the nicest people. He's a very pro-Israel, very pro-Jewish, wanting to bring everybody together and fight for Ukrainian cause, which is the right cause today. So anyway, I was be able to convince Marco to come out today and talk to me. Marco, thank you so much. Дякую дуже that you were able and you were willing to speak to me today and to my friends who are out there in this world. But you know what? I don't want to talk about your uncle.
Well, I'd like to start by thanking you for your kind words. I'm not sure how much I deserve them, but
well, the other reason we're going to speak English is because Marco and I only have one common language, is English, because he speaks Ukrainian and I don't, and I speak Russian and he doesn't. So English is our common language. No, Marco, it's seriously, I know how difficult it is for you, for your family. I know that that it's controversial name Bandera, and constantly going and explaining or apologizing, it just becomes, nonsense. And you say, oh, what the hell, people, go live your lives. I'm going to live my life. And you're not the first one. I also once met a nephew of Eichmann. He worked for the U.S. government as an inspector. He was a bean counter. He was an accountant, and he was conducting an inspection of my unit for financial, for finances. And after the inspection was over, we went for a beer, and I asked him. I said, "Any real?" I didn't even finish the sentence, and he says, "Yeah, it's my uncle." I'm like, "Really?" And he says, "Yeah." Well, he says, we didn't know he existed. We didn't know anything about him except what we watched on TV. So there's nothing I can add to you about him. But he says, "Yeah, it's true. He's a family member." So in any event, but I really want to talk about you, about my friend Marco Bandera. Of course, your uncle will come up in the conversation. It's just, that's the way things are. But I think it's like you were born in the United States, right?
California.
California. Oh, is it California the United States? Is it still the United States?
It's a different state of mind, but I think it's still the United States.
Yeah. So, your parents came to the United States with your grandfather, with your grandparents.
Yes.
They came as what? As DPs?
Yes.
Displaced people. It was your parents. Your nephew came, or your nephew came to Canada.
He went. Well, my cousin went to Canada.
I mean, your cousin. Sorry.
Yeah. My parents and family mostly settled in New England. So yeah, yeah, it was an interesting and not an easy time for immigrants, and it's interesting to see what's happening now with the immigrant experience. There's a lot of politics.
Yeah, it's never easy to be an immigrant, and especially if your name is known to the whole world. And your grandparents too, right, to the United States?
Yes.
Yeah, and
they ended up living with my my aunt and uncle and cousins, all in the same house in Connecticut.
In Connecticut, and but you knew your grandparents too, right?
Oh yes.
Yeah, you knew. So you because I've learned the history. Everybody has a different history. I've learned my history from my grandparents more than from my parents. But what did your parents do when they came to the United States? What were their jobs, or how did they survive?
My grandfather in the old country, I mean, as a young man, he was a Sitrovi Strelets. He was a rifleman in around World War I. Later on, he went on to help form the first cooperative in his town of Stri. He ended up being mayor of that town. And he came over here and was, I think, worked in a bank, but never a very high position. My uncle ended up working in the insurance industry, which isn't a surprise when you live in Hartford, Connecticut, and ended up dabbling in real estate a bit. My cousins ended up going to school, really good schools, because education was the way up for this immigrant group. They weren't farmers. They didn't have money. They didn't have land. So the way to pick yourself up is to get an education. So yeah, my dad was a teenager when he came over. His first jobs included things like digging sewer ditches and picking tobacco. There used to be tobacco fields outside of Hartford, Connecticut. He ended up getting a degree in economics. Didn't know what to do, so he joined the army and assumed that with his cultural and language skills, they might send him to Europe. And the army, in its wisdom, sent him to Fairbanks, Alaska.
Yeah, well, that makes sense.
After a few years there, he ended up using the GI plan and got a PhD at Berkeley. And that was
But it's interesting such an anti-Semitic family as yours would end up in a banking, in the insurance, in a real estate in Connecticut. I'm sure they had to work with some of the Jewish guys and gals out there, right? Of course, I'm being sarcastic, calling your family anti-Semitic, which is ridiculous.
yeah, I know that in the
I'm
years.
making fun of idiots who claim that.
I mean, my dad ended up most of his career at Temple University in Philadelphia.
Oh, my alma mater.
He got his job due to a Jewish friend, not who was in the department.
And that's the school I went to. So, what did you do? You grew up in a Ukrainian environment, and you're a huge Ukrainian patriot. You speak Ukrainian. You know the culture. You know how to make vareniki, and you went to university. And what did you study at the university?
Well, to correct one thing, for the most part, I didn't grow up in large Ukrainian community.
You didn't.
Born in California, we lived outside of Boston where there wasn't a huge community. It was cultural things that sort of ended up drawing me in.
Mm-hmm.
So I started off with a degree in economics. From there, I went, worked in Canada illegally for a year, building houses. Didn't want to work in a bank or in Philadelphia. I came across a new program that was being started at the University of Alberta in Edmonton in Canada. Did a degree in folklore there. I worked as a museum curator, got another master's in library science, worked as a librarian, worked as a computer programmer, and finally I worked as a project manager for an electric company in Philadelphia, helping them buy and integrate nuclear power plants into their system. So I've had a varied and checkered career.
Very immigrant career. Yeah. Now, you've told me an interesting story about your grandfather from World War I when he was a strelets, when he was a rifleman, and how he tell that story. I think it's a wonderful story to hear that the Ukrainians, like people would say, oh, you Jews, and I would always say, you Jews, there's so many Jews. There is mountain Jews, there is Bukhar Jews, there are Ashkenazis, there are the Sephardi. We're all like different. We some of us have nothing, religiously different. Some of us have nothing in common. I have more in common with the Soviet paratroopers than with some of the Jews. So tell us a story about Ukrainian story, that how you were told who and what Ukrainians were in those days.
Yeah, well, the conversation started, I think I was in junior high still, when miniseries about the Holocaust was.
Right. Yeah, I remember that.
And Ukrainians were portrayed largely as anti-Semitic. So I went to my grandmother to ask him, what's this all about?
Why are we like that?
This isn't something that I had ever thought about or studied or knew about or whatever. And he gave me a few examples. And one of them was that, again, around the time of World War I, that his unit, his Ukrainian Sich Rifleman unit, was called quickly and basically ran to a Jewish village to protect them from a group of other Ukrainians who were armed and about to attack that village. So I think one of the problems in those days was that you had a lot of different armed Ukrainian groups, and I'm sure others among Poles and Russians and whoever else, who weren't necessarily under central control of the government in Kiev. And so he gave me this example of them having gone to this Jewish village and protected them from other Ukrainians who were about to attack.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess were successful at it.
It's very interesting. It's very and it's so true because like Soviets portrayed your uncle, and during the Civil War, there was also a group called Makhno, commanded by this guy who's naturally a military leader. He would never study that, but he was naturally
They were anarchists, basically.
anarchist, but he was actually also protecting the Jews, but they made him also to look like the Soviets, that he was a big anti-Semite and he conducted all those pogroms, which was absolutely not true. And then your grandfather had World War II stories too, how he interacted with because your grandfather was in a concentration camp as well, right? No, it was just
he left before. Stepan Bandera was, and his brother in a Nazi concentration camp, and his brother died in a Nazi concentration camp.
Which is your other uncle?
Yeah, I wouldn't have ever met him. I never met either of them. I was born in 1957, and Stepan Bandera died in 1958, I believe.
Right. Well, but your grandfather also told you some World War II stories. How the
yeah, he just just almost as an aside mentioned, for instance, that during World War II, my grandmother had been giving a Jewish friend bread, and he had to take her aside and just tell her to be a little more careful, because if she was seen doing this, it would have been bad, very bad.
They would have shot.
And similarly, he told me how he came across somebody in the town beating up some Jews, and he didn't tell him to stop, but he told him to let up and not be so hard on them. And again, he was being careful and circumspect because of the trouble it would have caused if he had been more vocal about what he was.
And those collaborating friends would have turned him in just to get an extra, meat or an extra piece of bread. That's correct. And, I think that speaking of bread, I read somewhere where your uncle Stefan Bandera said, if you're gonna trade freedom for a piece of bread, you will have neither freedom nor bread. Is that true? Did you hear that? I know
I've heard a lot of quotes. So
it's like
probably, but I think you can say that for almost any nation.
Well, Churchill said something. If you seek, if you want to trade dignity for peace, you shall have neither dignity nor peace. And you want peace, but you shall get war. And it's a similar saying. Why do you think the Soviets were so? I mean, I'm sure there were more than Stepan Bandera. In those times, there were probably several Stepan Banderas out there operating for different causes, different reasons. Why do you think the Soviets picked your uncle to make him this evil guy who was a Nazi collaborator, huge anti-Semite, while they themselves are trying to kill the Jews, with the doctors thing? Why did they pick him? What was so special about this guy? I mean, he was in Nazi concentration camp, I believe, until 1944.
I'm not sure if he was as important as he's been made out to be. I think that he reflects a certain time also, so that to pass judgment on him according to today's woke standards.
Correct, right. Well, today we would not keep monument off,
Isn't perhaps, I think, fair to the time. I think he reflected the times of not only what was happening in Ukraine, but what was happening in other nations of the time. Um, I think that for better or worse, the name became, they made the name synonymous with fascism.
Right.
And so when you call somebody, initially somebody from Western Ukraine, a Banderite, then you were basically saying you're a fascist.
Right. Right.
That became the narrative. I think over time it's expanded so that now anybody who's Ukrainian or who speaks Ukrainian, for instance, will be branded as fascist and a Russophobe, and it's just a label that sticks. I know of the son of a dissident from the 1970s, who, when he was a little boy and visited some relatives in Crimea, and they heard him speaking in Ukrainian, their first words to him were "Таке мале, а вже Бандера." He's so small, but already he's a Bandera.
Yeah, it's the same thing. They say so small but already a Jew. Yeah, the same.
Okay,
They haven't come up with anything new. Yeah.
because they heard him speak this language. And in popular culture, for instance, there is a very famous group from Western Ukraine called Brate Hadyukine, the brothers Hadyukine, and one of their first songs and hits were "Mi Chlopці з Бандерштату," are the boys from the Bandera state.
Right.
Sort of parodying and making fun of this whole image of the fascist Banderites. And they're talking how they love their country and how they respect their parents and all of this type of stuff in the song. And it's been covered by maybe 4 or 5 other top groups in Ukraine also.
It's interesting that once I met you, I started to read and try to learn about your uncle, and it was interesting that when the Banderovцы, so-called Banderovцы, were put in the gulags, the units were disbanded, and some of them got captured and sent to gulags. They made a strong bond with the Zionists, because their ideologies were very similar. They had the same values. And I found that very interesting. I also found it very interesting that the monument, that huge monument, I don't know if you've seen in Lviv, for Stepan Bandera, has never been vandalized, which was very interesting to me too, because people hated him so much.
There's a lot of them in Western Ukraine that have been vandalized, and some in the early days, right before and after the renewal of independence, were done by remnants of the KGB and that were still entrenched.
But to get back to what in a gulag system where the Banderovцы and the Zionists won, then you send me some of the cartoons that the Soviets would put out about the same time, that they are together, that they are collaborating.
This goes back to this, I think, to the 60s. At least there was a popular satirical magazine with cartoons called Parrots, and a lot of anti-American, anti-Western, anti-Ukrainian, pro-Soviet stuff would be there. The one cartoon that always had the biggest impact on me was one showing a Zionist with the Star of David on his sleeve, and a rabid Ukrainian nationalist with a trezub, with a Ukrainian trident on his, protesting together in front of the United Nations. So on the one hand, Ukrainians were portrayed by the Soviets as being anti-Semitic. On the other hand, they were likened as two sides of the same coin in this cartoon. And I always found that juxtaposition to be very interesting and perhaps telling. And what you were saying about the people in the gulags, it's not just immediately after World War II. But when you look at the dissident movement and the Helsinki groups and all of those under Sakharov, that you had a lot of different interests. You had people who were more into labor rights, for instance. You had people who were into the Jewish questions and religious freedoms, and you had national groups. And all these groups managed to work together, seeing commonality and a common goal. And I think that was one of the critical factors that led to successes for those dissident groups. I think separately they would have been very, very weak. And of course, over the years, going back to Tsarist times, the whoever was in power would work to play one against the other. So when you had the Poles in power in Western Ukraine under colonial rule, then Jews weren't allowed to own land, but they were allowed to be shopkeepers. They were given jobs as tax collectors and things like that. So when you're a peasant who isn't allowed off the land, and you see these people coming and taking your money, and they're in a position of power, it causes problems. And you had similar things under the czars, where one group was played against the other. The term "the pale," beyond the pale. For a long time, Jews weren't allowed to live in Russia. They lived in Ukraine. And again, it's very easy to play one group against the other. And to the extent
Soviets, Soviets did the same thing during the Holodomor, during the artificially created famine.
And exactly. And if you control the narrative, if you control history, and you keep telling people, well, it's not us, it's them who's beating you up, then that's what you end up believing. The narrative makes perfect sense. And similarly, there are Ukrainians who believe to this day that Jews are the source of their problems. And it's stupid. I mean, you look and see, they have nothing to do with what's happening with Russian aggressions and stuff. And in fact, they've, for the most part, joined in supporting the independence movements, the Maidan, and the establishment of a renewed Ukrainian state.
And at the same time, and this is what I always bring as an example of you and my friendship, I say we look forward. And in United Nations, Ukraine always votes, on Israeli's part, and takes Israeli's side. And this is what we're looking for a future, that we can all work together and we can all live together and build independent and free and democratic and prosperous Ukraine. I don't see why it couldn't be done. I really truly believe that it is possible. And if you go to today's Ukraine, it's very multinational. There are Chechens, there are Uzbeks, there are Russians, there's Jews there, and I don't think anybody is really suffering there or being prosecuted or being forced, as my parents, watching Channel 1, Russian Channel 1, because that's the only one they could understand in Russian. And then the first time I traveled to Ukraine, they said, oh, don't speak Russian on the streets, because they're Banderovцы, they're walking around with schmeizers and they shoot you right away, on the street. Because of that, little did they know that I told them that I know Marko Bandera, and he put the word in for me. I'm not going to get shot on the streets by Banderovцы. Yeah, but it's still interesting to me. It's still interesting to me why they picked your uncle, because I don't want to belittle him. I don't think he was that huge, that important. There were other groups there. There were other like Melnik and others that were vicious kind of guys. And there were guys that were collaborators with the Nazis, but yet they picked your uncle. Maybe why were they threatened by your uncle more than anyone else? Because he was
one thing is that,
or what?
I mean, up until well into the 50s, then there was still armed resistance in Ukraine. And to some extent, my understanding is this was being pushed from the West. And of course, Stepan Bandera was involved in this. I think to some extent, this gave them a boogeyman also, somebody that they could always point to as a, again, building this narrative of fascism and anti-Russian Russophobia and all these other things. I mean, it's I mean, my grandfather once made a comment about in the West, all of these Ukrainians who call themselves polkovniki, like commanders and military commanders, які ніколи пороху не нюхали, who never had smelled gunpowder.
Right, they never smelled them.
So, yeah, I mean, there's so many different views that come from all over the place. I remember in the 70s when they let out perhaps the most prominent Ukrainian dissident, who was incredibly nationalistic. And he was asked about Crimea. I heard him speaking at Harvard. And basically he said that as far as he was concerned, Crimea had to be 100% Ukrainian and there was no room for returning Crimean Tatars. I think if Ukrainians tried to do it alone in Ukraine right now, without the support of other nationality groups within the country, including Jews and Crimean Tatars and Georgians who might be there, and
Hungarians,
even Russians, then I don't think that Ukraine would exist now, even in its precarious position.
Correct. Yes, I agree. I agree with you.
And this is very different from, for instance, the experience in Russia, where when the Soviet Union was created, if you count in Kuban, where predominant language was Ukrainian at the time, parts of Siberia, Ukrainian was spoken by more people in the Soviet Union than Russian was. Yet today there is not one Ukrainian language school in all of Russia. And in the meantime, they're screaming.
They say, well, Putin said there is no such country as Ukraine. There's no such language as Ukrainian.
They're screaming now about how Russians and language is being suppressed in Ukraine. Meanwhile, an incredible percentage of school and media is all in Russian. And even though they're a minority in the country, then they manage somehow to push their language. And anybody who says then that they want Ukrainian to be the predominant language in Ukraine is immediately given labels such as Russophobe, fascist, Banderite.
Absolutely. Although I can tell you that when I'm in Ukraine, I have not, well, once, but she was an idiot. She was, but really never have I, somebody speaks Ukrainian to me and I tell them, I'm sorry, I don't understand Ukrainian. I can only do it in English or in Russian. They immediately would switch to Russian. And if I would thank them in Ukrainian, I'd say, "Дякую дуже." They would smile and they would be pleased with this. There is a way to communicate, and I have never felt that anybody really looked at me like I was weird or something because I was speaking Russian, and I speak Russian like a Russian. And
look at Poland, for instance, when Solidarność started up, the Solidarity movement, the students, their first two demands were first that they not have to not be forced to take Marxism classes at the universities.
That's a good one, yeah.
And the second was that they not be forced to take Russian language.
My only not complaint, but my only concern is that as a military man, that there is no question that there is a war between Russia and Ukraine. And unfortunately, Russians are winning the information war, which is very important, and Ukrainians are losing the information war. One of the reasons Ukrainians lose the information war, it's like my parents would watch TV. They couldn't find a Ukrainian channel where they would understand. Everything was in Ukrainian, so they would listen to the Russian channel. And you know, in the United States, we have a huge Russian-speaking diaspora: Georgians, Uzbeks, Jews, Russians. They don't hear the side of Ukraine. So always when I'm in Ukraine, so you need somebody like a Voice of America that talks in your language. So the entire people who have a common language, Russian, would hear your side of the story, whether it's in Germany, in Canada, in Australia, in Poland.
It's certainly more than a question of semantics when, if you look at any Western English language broadcast, when they refer to the so-called conflict in Eastern Ukraine, they define the problem as a civil war or as separatists. And of course, it isn't separatists. These are Russian invaders.
And it's not a civil war, definitely not a civil war.
And it's not a civil war. So again, I think that most Americans don't understand how strong Russian disinformation campaigns are in the West, and how they poke at information spheres in all ways possible. So, you know, one example is there's an excellent academic who used to be ambassador in Moscow, McFall. And he's come out, for instance, in support, or not very long ago, he referenced Ukrainian nationalists who had provoked some anti-Russian stuff in Odessa. Well, of course, this had been a campaign done by Russia in order to make Ukraine look bad. He hadn't delved deeply enough into it and went along with the narrative that he had heard.
Well, I know that ambassador, unfortunately, and he replaced a great ambassador who understood the situation very deeply. So yes, that
and I also was disappointed when he came out and positively eulogized what's his name, Stephen Cohen from Princeton, who was, of course, a mouthpiece over the years for the new Russia, and had, you know, supported the idea that Ukraine isn't a real country.
Unfortunately, our academia is wrong in many ways, and those professors at the universities ought to get out more often. But worse than that, they get appointed and getting to the positions such as ambassadorships, and they still think that they're just writing some sort of a thesis and defending their doctoral degree, which is as related to reality as well. Anyway, I'm not gonna bash them. It's I do that enough. So now that we're talking about nationalists, Ukrainian nationalists, I know a bunch of Ukrainian nationalists in Ukraine, and I find most of, I mean, of course, some of them there are some idiots that are a little bit, you know, and they have anti-Semitic or anti-Armenian or whatever xenophobic views. But most of the guys I know that would pravoseki, you know, right sector, and they're fighters. They're good guys. They fight, and if they don't care. They say, if you fight along with us, then you're one of us. If you fight against us, we're going to kill you. So I kind of like that approach from them, and they I can tell you that they treat me very, you know, they treat me quite, you know, they don't treat me like an enemy or somebody who's no, they treat me as a friend. Many of them would stop me on the street and shake a hand and give me their patch, or give me a червоно-черный banner. So what do you think about them in general?
I think there's a problem, especially when Westerners are interpreting what some of these groups and what some of the terminology being used means. So for instance, in the Soviet Union, World War II was referred to as the Great Patriotic War. So I know a lot of people who in Ukraine will interpret the word patriotism or patriotic as something that sort of references that Russian or Soviet mentality or view of nationhood or whatever. The word Nazia means simply nation. And I don't think that your average nationalist in Ukraine views the word or equates it with fascism. Nationalism, I think one can look at as a continuum. I think patriotism, singing the national anthem or displaying an American flag on Flag Day, those are all, I think, expressions of nationalism.
I'm a nationalist.
And at the other extreme, you can have something like what's in Cuba. You know, that's certainly a type of nationalism there. So I think more and more in woke society in the West, then nationalism is equated with more and more with fascism and with something that's negative and to be run away from. And I think the problem for Ukrainians is that as they become more and more conscious of things like their liberation movements, the Ukrainian insurgent army during World War II, that they use the word more and more proudly. And I think it's somewhat confusing to them when the West reacts as if they're calling themselves nationalists, then they must be fascist type of mentality.
Right, right. Because I'm an American nationalist, and I think you are too. So I find that especially when the situation is as difficult as it is in Ukraine today, and they're fighting a war. The best of the best are getting killed every day. There's nothing wrong with being a nationalist as long as you are.
I've met Americans here who have argued with me that singing the national anthem or displaying the flag is basically nationalism and fascism, and something that is to be avoided at all costs.
Probably university.
And I'm thinking, wait a minute, you guys have no idea what my parents and grandparents ran away from.
Right.
And how grateful they are to find what they found in this country.
Right.
And that isn't to say that immigrants, even white immigrants, haven't found all sorts of discriminations in this country. My dad, when he was taking his first economics classes at University of Connecticut, had a class where he was the best student in the class, but he didn't get the best grades. And when he went to the teacher and asked him why, the teacher said, well, it wouldn't do to give an immigrant from Eastern Europe a better grade than an American. Okay.
Well, it is probably stupid. Those professors are stupid. That's
not that long ago.
But it's a nationalism. They're saying displaying a flag or singing a national anthem is a nationalism, which is equivalent to Nazis. And your father, and it's probably the same professors who not giving a top grade to your father, which he deserved, because they're probably of the same type of professorship. They're saying one thing and they're trying to preach one thing, but they're doing complete opposite. And we know that the Bolshevik coup d'état, which they all call revolution, was not created by the peasants and sailors. It was created by the professors, by the journalists, by the students, by intellectuals who knew better what the peasants and the sailors needed and how they should live. So I have a very difficult time today in the United States, also with what we call the elitists or our intellectuals, let's say, who know better what
Yeah, I
a
mean,
white professor at the university knows way better what a black lady in I don't know, in California needs, what her needs are. So yes, and I think that it is, we're talking about but our government and our system in the United States, we do not support any sort of a racism or any sort of bigotry, especially in our military. I can speak for our military. It was frowned upon big time. I never even had experience in 30 years. Some people would make fun of me and say, hey, you're Russian. But of course, I was the only Soviet-born to be commissioned officer in the armed forces of the United States during Reagan time, during the peak of Cold War. So it was, it was kind of understandable. But I've never experienced that somebody tried to pass my promotion or not give me a medal that I deserved. So there's no government, there's no systemic, what they call racism in our country. I don't agree with it.
So something else I think it's important to sort of think of is that it's over the years, Russians have painted Ukrainian nationalism as being inherently fascist and all of that stuff. When you go back to independence around World War I again, a lot of these Ukrainian leaders, like Khrushchevsky, for instance, he was a socialist. This is a guy who, when they were trying to figure out what kind of flag Ukraine should have, initially there was a big push to have a hammer and sickle in it, because that was all part of that sort of movement there. In terms of their democratic ideals, you had all the nationalities in that first government were given representation. So you had Russians and Jews and any others who were there. They had were given representation in the government. And if they had a fault, perhaps it was that they were too democratic and focused on that rather than actually implementing reforms that would have more quickly impacted the people's lives for the better.
Right, and of course you couldn't control, you couldn't change everybody at the same time. And as Petlura said, listen, I'm not anti-Semite. I have what was his minister of
the equivalent of the Secretary of State was Jewish.
Yeah, it was Jewish guy, but he says, but some of my colonels, some of my commanders are idiots, and they're peasant idea.
And like I mentioned, for instance, my grandfather's experience where he was protecting a Jewish settlement from, he wasn't in command or anything, but his group was protecting from another Ukrainian group. So, and then you had Makhno and you had all these Skoropatskis and all these other groups. So a lot of confused issues, a lot of confused groups without a centralized command.
Sure. Now, do you know if your uncle Stepan had Jews in his units? Did anybody talk about that? Were they part of it? Some people say there were some doctors. Then somebody said there was also someone else, like one of the commanders was. So I don't.
There were definitely Jews who were part of the UPA, and I think it's interesting too. I think one could question, for instance, why some Jews joined Soviet resistance elements when these were groups that less than 10 years earlier had helped implement the famine in Ukraine. I mean, you can really, really get into quagmire there. You can get into a quagmire when you talk about Poles who were instrumental in atrocities with Ukrainians, and then Ukrainians talk about, and then Of course, Poles talk about Ukrainians who committed atrocities on Poles.
Now we can, of course, we can say even today, some of us in my Jews,
The one thing,
the Jews, some of the Jews of us, we can't believe that there are Jews that are in the Democratic Party supporting Biden. This, and then there are Democratic Jews. They can't believe that there are Jews that supporting Trump. I mean, we all fight among each other as well here because. So yeah, you can go on like this. But let me ask you another question. Let me ask you another. This is hypothetical question. Let's say UPA won. And Stepan Bandera becomes a president of Ukraine. Would he be like a democratic president, or would he be a dictator? What do you think he would have been as a head of the Ukrainian state?
I have no idea, and I think that
it's a stupid question.
Again, I think it's perhaps unfair to think in terms of today's standards and today's way of looking at the world and all, because these are different times, different people, and I think worldwide people think differently and act differently.
I always like Kamal Atatürk. He says, "I'm a dictator, but after me, it's going to be total democracy." And he enforced that.
I think what's interesting is that during World War II, these Ukrainian units fought against both the Germans and the Russians.
Right.
It wasn't, and I think one can almost make them interchangeable, where, the Soviets talk about liberating from Eastern Europe from fascism, but meanwhile, people they liberated, they stood up against walls and shot or sent to Siberia.
Sure. And there is a very good movie and a very good book written by Savella. It's called Cold Tango, and it shows there how everybody got caught with everyone, and everybody is at fault, and no one is at fault. Everybody is just.
Is it better to be killed by a Nazi or by a Russian soldier?
Well, and I always say when there is an argument about Holodomor and the Holocaust, I say, well, what is it better, to starve to death or to be gassed? How you're getting, your family is getting destroyed either way. So this is not a very good choice that we're arguing about it. What's it's a stupid argument. But Marco, I don't want to take more of your time, but I would like many of my fans, and I think they're your fans now too. Because many of them ask me, I always talk about you, but they don't believe me you exist. So now, I've proven that you do exist, that I do have a friend like you. And I'm very proud of it. I'm very proud that I know you, because I think that you are a symbol of unification, a symbol of Ukrainian struggle for independence, a symbol of Ukrainian will to share the American values, to be a democratic country. And I'm very happy. I thank God that I've met you that day, and we were able to maintain a good relationship for so long. Now, what would you like to tell my friends in Ukraine? What would you want them to know?
I think one of the important things is that here in the West, Ukrainians who emigrated here, and they're, the people who are born here, have long been big supporters of Ukraine, even before independence. But that said, we're Americans. I mean, I'm born here. I'm an American. It's not up to me to decide what's going to happen there, what's going to be the final result. I know that it's been really painful for a lot of people to see what's been happening, and I'm not even talking in terms of aggression from outside, but some of the stupidities within the country.
That's the most important.
My dad had worked so long trying to be a positive influence on on things in Ukraine. And when somebody like Yanukovych was elected, it pretty much broke his spirit. You know, how can you do something that stupid? And there seems to be a bit of a tradition there where, you know, you pick somebody who's better, and then the next election you pick somebody who's bad, and then somebody better, and somebody bad. It seems to happen every election. And again, it's not ultimately what we want or even what America wants, but what those people are going to decide. The problem is, I think, also that at some point, with all the pressures from both outside and within the country, at some point it might be too late to come back from the break. So we'll see what happens. I mean, I always wish the best for Ukraine, but we don't know what the ultimate outcome will be. I think when things go bad politically in the United States, the institutions are strong enough to withstand the pressures, whether people are for or against one president or the other. There will be something else down the line.
Well, hope so, because but I was just going to say it's in our country when Trump won, half of the country said, "Oh, I can't believe we voted this guy," and "Oh my God, I can't believe."
But again, I think America can survive that.
And then when the Biden became president of the United States, another half of America said, "Oh, I can't believe after 4 years of everything that Trump did."
Again, America though will survive this. I'm not sure.
Oh, I hope so. I'm
not sure how long Ukraine can survive and withstand these pressures. It's too new.
Well, all you and I can do is pray for Ukraine and help as much as we can. And I think you've helped, and you've done a lot, although you've done it very quietly and behind the scenes because you're just not a public person. And it's understandable why you're not a public person. You don't want to be ridiculed and attacked and blamed for everything. You're almost like a Jewish guy. You don't want to be blamed for everything that goes there just because of your last name. But I think you have done quite a bit. And I think that if Ukraine would need you, you'd be there. And I'm not even Ukrainian, and I have nothing. I wasn't even born in Ukraine. I don't have any connections to Ukraine except you and a few other friends, and now many friends in Ukraine. But I would also be in Ukraine if they need me. So in that note, I really, again, Marco, I can't thank you enough. Дуже дякую. If you want to say anything else, you're welcome to say. But I basically just wanted people to know. I want people to know about heroes that nobody talks about, that nobody knows they exist, but they do exist. And the glory is taken by the politicians, by the movie stars, by the journalists. But the real heroes pay a huge price, and they do the right thing. And I think, and I believe, I don't think, I believe, I know that you're on the right side of history. And you can be proud of name of and the family of Bandera.
I mean, we've talked a lot about some of these relationships between Ukrainians and Jews in Ukraine, for instance. But I think it's also important to note that when it comes to emigre organizations, for instance, the group I was involved in Philadelphia, then they've been very active in working together with Jewish organizations and develop these relationships. And I think that's all for the good. When people understand their commonality, it makes all of them stronger.
Absolutely. Thank you, Marco. And you play a huge part in it. You're huge part in it. And I think another thing, I know people are going to be writing to me, what happened to you, what's going on. I did hurt my elbow and shoulder, but it's okay. I'm healing.
War wounds.
War wounds, yeah, in Miami. War wounds in Miami. And I also say that one of the reasons why Ukraine is so special to me, because besides Israel, Ukraine is the only country that freely elected an open Jew to be president, whether he's good or not, whether you agree with him or not. But majority of adult people consciously made a decision. So, when people say, oh, it's an anti-Semitic country, oh, yeah, it's a hugely anti-Semitic country, but most of them voted for an openly Jewish president. And before that, it was an openly Jewish prime minister. And the guy who heads the opposition is also open Jew, religious Jew, wears a yarmulke with a name like Rabinowitz. He can't be any more Jewish. And Rabinowitz calls the Jewish president a fascist. Now, that's democracy. I love about it. And again, Marco, you're a huge part of it. You're a huge part of unifying Ukraine, unifying people. Because of that, you are my personal hero.
One of the most important academics in Western Ukraine was Ivan Franko.
Mm-hmm.
One of his seminal works was called Moses. And I think that academics in Ukraine long recognized a commonality in experiences when it came to Jewish people and Ukrainians. And again, I always found that something to celebrate rather than something to cause discord. So, and hopefully, I think attitudes have changed, because I remember in the 70s when I was in college meeting Jews who'd come from the Soviet Union. And more often than not, they identified themselves as Russian. And I'm finding that that's changed or changed.
Yes, changed.
Increasingly, they'll not shy away from the idea of.
Now they don't call themselves Russian. I don't even call myself Russian any longer, which I used to. And of course, in the military, if you would call Pentagon in my days and say, can I speak to the Russian? They would say, hey, Yuri, come on, it's for you. But now they don't. I point out that I was a Jewish guy born in Russia. I'm not Russian. Or a lot of people now say, no, I'm Ukrainian. I'm Georgian. I was born in Uzbekistan. I'm not Russian. So it's true.
I would hope this is also a reflection of the present day situation in Ukraine, where nationalities and religious groups are not only tolerated, but recognized and celebrated.
Absolutely. I'm there. I can tell. I can see. It doesn't say that there is not one idiot who will come out and knock the menorah down or spray some paint on the wall. But we have it here. We even have it in Israel. These kind of idiots.
And there's more than one. And the problem there is that it can take just one person,
right?
Stupid comment that is made, and then before you know it, it's been spread in the West even.
That all the Ukrainians, of course, understand. I mean, we understand that it takes, if my grandmother always said, if Ivan steals something, that Ivan is a thief. If you steal something, then Rabinowitz steals something, then all of the Jews are thieves. So, that unfortunately it applies not only to Jews, but to other nations or other people who fight and who stand and want to be recognized as a nation.
There was a famous Polish academic named Bistron who wrote a seminal work called Megalomania Narodowa, the megalomania of the people. And in it, he pointed out how different groups, in order to elevate themselves, will put down others. So, you have the English make fun of the French, the Poles make fun of the Mazurs. The way Tom Lear said, everybody hates the Jews in one of his songs. But it's the only positive thing about it is that if they make jokes about you, then at least they recognize you. So growing up in the States, nobody knew what a Ukrainian was. But when I worked and studied in Canada, all of a sudden, a lot of Ukrainians there, and I heard Ukrainian jokes for the first time. And I thought, great, finally we're equal with all these other people that are made.
But Americans. So when I came to United States and I went to college, and in my military class there was a guy who was Ukrainian. He was an upperclassman. He was in charge of me, and he says, "You were Russian, you were." And I'm like, "Yeah, yes, sir, I was." And he's yeah, he says, "I'm Yuki." And I'm like, "Who's Yuki?" I had no idea who Yuki is, but I guess he was also born in the United States, so Ukrainian was too long for him to say. So they're all called, And then I realized that a lot of Ukrainians, young, the generation that's born in the United States, they call themselves Yukis because it's just short and concise. Yeah, it's interesting how the. Okay, Marco, I think I took enough of your time. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.